David gets to the end of his life, as he's old, and he spends time reflecting on the younger days, and particularly reflecting back to this transition moments as he was heading towards being king, and thinking back to the old king, Saul. He loved Saul, seeing so much potential in the old king who preceded him. He was a good king who saw himself as the beginning, the foundation, the first steps in a dynasty that in his mind would last forever. Whether he understood fully that from the king would come the Messiah who would live forever, that maybe not, but he certainly at least was hopeful that his throne would last forever. Certainly, he'd heard the prophecies of Samuel, the prophet, who came along and said his throne would not last. Sorry, there goes, I don't know what my mic is doing. We will try that again. Samuel had said Saul's throne would not last forever, but surely Saul, in the depths of who he was, hoped that it would continue. David knew the good that Saul had done, but he'd also seen the massive mistakes, and well he should, because many of Saul's greatest mistakes, David almost ends up dead because of many of them. Yet there was greatness. And his greatest achievement, surely in David's mind, would be his offspring, his children. Particularly two. One, Michal, becomes his first wife. Beautiful, passionate in her early days. Yet, tragically, circumstances and great mistakes had alienated his first love. The love turned to bitterness, probably in both of them. Certainly in hers. And then there was her brother, Jonathan. Older than David. But David and Jonathan had become closer than brothers. And as David contemplates the past, you can almost hear the thoughts rising, wishing once again that things had been different, perhaps with Saul, and much more so with his kids. That things could have worked out better with Michal, and that Jonathan had been able to stay by his side through his life. So much of the Bible is story. There's 66 small books within the Bible. Some spend their time explaining God, explaining life. Some are filled with warnings to people. Some tell us how we are to live. But so much of it, remarkably, is storytelling. And we are invited to enter into the stories to see, at times, glory, at times to see horror, at times to see love, and at other times to see bitterness. We're invited to look at the lives of the characters, to engage with them, to see a character who is in one moment heroic, and then just a moment later fails bitterly. At times the Bible will give me a command to say, be faithful. And at other times, it invites us to engage with someone who struggles to be faithful and invites us to share with their experiences, with their stories. Not so much for the purpose of telling us to imitate them or don't imitate them, but perhaps to help us to understand our own circumstances in light of life and faith a little bit differently. As we experience their stories, We understand our own lives in the light that's a little different. Author Eugene Peterson, who wrote a book about David called Leaping Over the Wall, enters into the story of David and Jonathan and says it is a remarkable story to look at in the midst of the pessimism of life in the present modern world. And he says the stories, stories meaning the stories of David and Jonathan in particular, the stories of survival and lasting are the ones that determine the nature and meaning of what it means to be human. And somewhere in those stories, if we look closely enough, we find covenants of friendship that help bind beginnings and endings into the covenantal purpose of God. This is kind of a fancy way of saying we engage in these stories sometimes to discover perhaps one of the reasons David becomes the great king who he becomes. Maybe in comparison with Saul, who starts great but fails. Maybe what makes David great, one of the things that makes him great, is the fact that God places a gentleman by the name of Jonathan into his path. Somebody will help him build his life. 1 Samuel chapter 18. David had just defeated the great giant Goliath. And then as a youth, who lived outside the structures of the army, leads the people to a military victory over the technologically and numerically superior Philistines. And right at the beginning of the next chapter, Crown Prince Jonathan appears. And the two immediately hit it off and quickly become the closest of friends. That chapter begins. Here are the first 4 verses. As soon as he had finished speaking to Saul, speaking of David, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David. And Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him and gave it to David. And his armor, even his sword, and his bow, and his belt. We have a lot of ground to cover scripturally in what I'm hoping will be a shorter sermon as we head towards communion. But I want us to understand, this is a God-given friendship to move David forward in his life. And the question we might want to ask, that I ask at least, is at what stage does Jonathan know that David will take his throne? Not just his father's throne. His father will die. God has said David will replace him. Man says Jonathan should. That's been promised to him his whole life. Forever he has been told, you will be the next king of Israel. Saul certainly worried very quickly that David will take his place. I think kind of a little later in the chapters when Saul figures it out. Jonathan is going to lose his throne to his friend. It's not David's fault, but it's true nonetheless. And yet, Jonathan gives to David his tunic, his armor, his sword. A little bit earlier in the book of 1 Samuel, we discover that Jonathan, at that moment of time, owns one of only 2 iron swords in all of Israel. Probably a few more by this date, but this is a kingly sword. Kingly armor. King's clothing. The apparel of the king. The things that set him apart, that yes, this is the next king. He freely gives to his friend David. The symbols of an ancient king are willingly surrendered to David. Saul is going to fight to keep them. Jonathan gives them away freely. As we go through this sermon, I'm going to kind of throw 5 thoughts about friendship that I think the Bible gives us, not as much to say this is what a friend looks like, but ideas to kind of enter into and wrestle with. As I look at this, friendship, which is a unique, incredible, odd almost relationship. A friend wants to see the other one succeed. Friend wants to see the other one succeed. It's certainly true. Jonathan, I think later there's some passages which indicate David wants Jonathan to succeed as well. They want them to succeed. Secondly, a friend loves the other as much as they love themselves. Bases friendship on the love of God. That's the implication of being a covenant. And see this friendship as a gift of God, in which I have a responsibility to love my friend. The story continues. And we have Saul kind of making a mess of things. We have 3 chapters. I'm going to go over in just like 7 or 8 minutes. So hang on tight. 3 chapters. David's popularity immediately starts to grow among the people. The people are singing about David. They're singing their praise for David. David is also singing. He's still getting his harp out, and he's playing for the king. And when the king goes into having a bad mood, David still plays for him, as he did a couple of chapters earlier. He does. He sits down and starts to play for Saul. Usually that calms Saul down, but we're told in chapter 18 that all of a sudden a malevolent spirit comes upon him and he starts to prophesy. We're going to go through the theology of all that today because that takes us down quite the rabbit hole. But the point is, he starts to prophesy, and all of a sudden he throws a spear at David. And I wonder, the Bible does not say this, but I wonder if the prophecy is he suddenly understands that this boy who's playing before him is the one who will supplant him. I kind of wonder if at this moment, all of a sudden a light bulb goes on in Saul's mind, and he takes a spear and he throws at David and he misses, and that's going to be Saul's first fail at trying to kill David. Now, if you were with us a week ago, we looked at probably the most famous story in the entire Bible, David and Goliath. Find it on our YouTube channel, on our website. If you want to go back and look at it, but in that, Saul had promised whoever kills the giant can marry his daughter. Well, okay. So Saul looks at him as a threat, and he says, okay, I promised you Merab, my daughter. It's not the girl David wants. David's not really feeling it with Merab. And Saul, however, has promised. The deal changes. Okay, David, you want to marry into the royal family, you need to go out and you need to kill a whole lot more Philistines. And David declines. Says, no, I'm not worthy to be the son of the king, son-in-law of the king. I'm not going to marry her. And it's Saul's second fail. But Saul's got eyes. He's not a dummy. Realize, okay, I'm not going to be able to trap David with my oldest daughter, but then he sees David chatting with his younger daughter and realize, oh, there are sparks here. He kind of likes Mikhail, and Mikhail very much likes him. And so he says, okay, David, you can marry my younger daughter if you go off and you kill 100 Philistines and you prove it to me, 100 male Philistines. We're not going to get to the gory details because he gives some really fun detail. Look it up in 1 Samuel. Anyways. David says, okay, this is Saul's way again. He's going to kill 100 of our enemies? Really? Not going to really happen. But he goes out, he not only fulfills the king's demand, he doubles it. He kills 200, he brings back proof, and he's allowed to marry Michal. It's the third veil that Saul has, trying to kill him. He gets the girl, and at this point, Jonathan intervenes in the story, and he goes to Saul, and he starts to defend the one who will steal his throne. Jonathan defends David at this point. Friends defend, that's my third friendship point. Friends defend each other. Yes, David is the enemy. He's honest with that, I'm sure, Saul. But we're doing well by him. And he clearly cares about us. And so he works for a bit for Saul. And at one stage, he kind of calls over, oh, new son-in-law, come here. Why don't you play for me again? And once again, it doesn't work like it used to. The rage starts to build up in Saul. And he picks up his spear again, and for a second time, he hucks it at David. And once again, Saul fails to kill him. Poor fails. So he gets this bright idea. Let's just do this methodically. He calls over his best assassins and says, assassins, I want you to go over to David's house, David and Michal's house, and I want you to kill David. Michal somehow hears about it, helps David to escape, and the assassins arrive at the house, and Michal looks at him and says, sorry, you can't talk to David, he's not feeling well right now. So they go back to Saul and say he's not feeling well, and Saul, I think, gets really upset, saying, who cares how he feels when we kill him? I mean, really, what difference does it make? So they go back, and they realize he is in bed, and they go pull the covers off and realize what Michal has done is she's put an idol in the bed, put some animal fur on the head so it looks like there's hair, put some clothes on it, and to trick them. I gotta tell you, I think I've seen this plot in so many 80s movies. This was kind of a big deal then. I don't know. He gets away. 5 fails. David goes off, joins the prophet Samuel. They go into hiding for a bit. Saul hears where they are, and so he heads out to kill David, and all of a sudden, God intervenes in a miraculous way, and we don't know the full story. It just says that Saul started prophesying. We don't know exactly what happened, but whatever reason, it becomes failure number 6. David and Jonathan meet up, and we have a long chapter, and they start debating how much of a threat is Saul. They start talking about where things are at. They don't fully agree on things. Jonathan thinks Saul's not quite as bad as David is starting to see him to be. And they have a discussion. It's about the throne. It's about who's going to take over the throne. Really, you get down to it, it's about politics. You want to divide 2 friends, start talking about politics. Not true. They start disagreeing about things. We have a really long chapter, a really long discussion. I was reading this week, an author by the name Tim Keller recently passed away, who said, everyone says they want community and friendship. But mention accountability or commitment to people and they run the other way. And I think these 2 are different. See, this was an accountability in which they were sharpening one another. They were challenging each other's beliefs to see things a little bit differently. What usually happens when somebody challenges us? We go off and sulk. Usually. Or we put up a fierce opposition, and then we avoid that person from now on. And we complain about them. Well, David and Jonathan instead find ways to collaborate. They go into they come up with this really elaborate plot that we're not going to get bogged down to, but the bottom line is, in it, Saul reveals himself to his son in a way that he never has before. Goes so far as trying to kill his own son. He reveals how much anger and bitterness and rage have consumed his life. And Jonathan suddenly realizes that David's life is definitely in danger. So they come together and they weep. They embrace. They're warriors. We read the exploits throughout the Bible, throughout this part of the Bible anyways, of the way that they go off to glorious battle and fight. But here they weep. That doesn't sound like warriors getting together, does it? Trying to be macho. It doesn't sound like them just trying to prove their strengths to one another. They are able, and this is another friendship, know that they're able to be weak and vulnerable together. That it's okay for things not to be right. Often we get together with somebody and we're talking about their problems and we want to come up with superficial solutions. We throw out ideas to them. Or the conversation just turns into a feel sorry for me pity party. Often might end up in a situation like Jonathan starts talking about Saul and starts telling David about how things went horribly wrong, and David's sitting there. If he's anything like how most of us typically are, he sits there, and as he's listening, his mind is going thinking about what he's going to say and about the next story he wants to tell. And instead, these two are actually listening to one another for real, weeping together, and just being together. Just being vulnerable and sitting together. Eventually, stand and look at each other and say, go in peace. Even through a rocky world, they found ways to find strength in one another. A couple chapters later, there's one more time they get together. It's in 1 Samuel 23, starting verse 13, just a couple of verses. We don't have a lot on it. But fast forward the story a little bit. We'll fill in the blanks the next couple of weeks. But David is now with about 600 men at his disposal, and they're in hiding from the king in the southern part of the deserts of Judah. He's been fighting the Israelis. He's been fighting the Philistines. They have a guarded camp, and you can just picture the guards out at the front of the camp, keeping a watch. And suddenly they're surprised because there's one lone person walking. It's not normal in the desert. Usually if it is one person out there walking, they're kind of gasping for water, barely hanging on to life. This is somebody who doesn't look like that. He's coming striding in strong. And they look and say, isn't that the crown prince, Jonathan? You better get David. So they do, and David and Jonathan immediately run together and embrace. Jonathan had found David where Saul could not. And he had snuck away, And it says in the scriptures, the two of them get together, and we're not given much of the conversation, we're not given much detail, other than they get together to encourage one another. We get an interesting comment in there as well. Jonathan says, "You will be king, and I will step aside and stand beside you." In other words, I will not stand in the limelight. I'm just there to support you. They have an encouragement that pushes friends to grow and achieve all that they can. Encouragement is not just patting someone on the back and saying, "Good job." It's something much bigger. It is an encouragement that pushes the friend to achieve. And the friend accepts encouragement. Just inviting us today into this private story. It's not a command, almost, within this story to be a friend like this, or to act this way, or to have a friend like this. But instead, I think we're given this story to help us see the way that a friendship develops the foundation of David's life, and then consider the way in which we have friends. The vast majority of relationships we are in are rather superficial, and that's normally you can have a deep relationship with everybody. But sometimes we need to actively pursue somebody who can speak into our lives and we can speak into theirs. And I think because it's a divine moment, we need to be prayerful. Many here probably have 1, 2, 3 friends that they can go to and say, "Hey, I'm struggling." And their friend can come to you and say, "Hey, I'm struggling." And really, it'd be meaningful. Others here probably don't. We need to pray. We can. That we can be part of people's lives. Delve into their lives and let them delve into ours. To help each other grow. I mean, our spouse could certainly play a role in that, absolutely, but we almost need somebody within our own gender as well, who can challenge us, and we can challenge them, to help each other grow. See, I think the whole point of this is we see what David gets out of this. We get this story from David's perspective. I think Jonathan got a lot out of this friendship as well. We get it more from David's perspective, though. And David got a lot out of it. He's the one who will, not to give away more of the story, Jonathan doesn't live real long. But David, it's going to set up a foundation that's going to play a role in his life for decades. A relationship that helps us become more like the person Jesus meant us to be. Jesus certainly is that friend. But there's a call to go deeper with individuals, to bring Jesus out in each other. We're going to focus on Jesus for a few moments. We're going to move to communion and spend a few moments focusing our lives fully on the one who died to bring us salvation and hope. So I'm going to invite our elders to come